Welcome to the Power of One. My name is Brian Berry and I'm your host. This program demonstrates that one person can make a difference. Today we're very fortunate to have Stephen Williams, a Vestry member from All Saints Church. So thank you very much for being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really am honored to be on the show.
Great. I'm really excited to have you discuss with us a few of the topics that we've chatted about in the past. So the first one is there's an All Saints racial justice committee or group. Could you talk a little bit about that and what its function is and what your role is on it?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I am a member of the Racial Justice Ministry. My wife Clara is the co-chair on that particular ministry. There is also a Racial Justice Advisory Board at the church. And this is really unique about All Saints, I think. And that came out of really the evolution, right, of talking about diversity and what it is in that particular institution. Prior to that, there was an organization called Cross Colors, which was to further diversity in that space of the Episcopal Church.
So diversity as far as the membership of the church? Or
the membership from the standpoint of getting communication between the memberships of the church. The history of the Episcopal Church and All Saints Church in particular is really quite interesting, and I think and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about telling our whole story, but I think one of the things was the way that it evolved, as a lot of churches did evolve in Pasadena. They were very, very monocultural.
Yeah.
All those churches, and its location is for a specific reason why it's where it is. And First Baptist, there's other. If you see First on a name, there's a reason for that, because it was the first. But so.
Well, I think that's emblematic of many of the other mainline churches in Old Pasadena or in the central part of Pasadena, whether it's the Presbyterian, the Congregational, the Methodist, the Baptist. So they were predominantly, I think, what you're indicating is white. And in the case of All Saints, somewhat affluent. Would you say that's true?
Well, it definitely was. I think if you look at the origins of the church and the founding fathers, I mean, we're talking from the late 1800s, and it was in one location and then moved to its present location. And I think the church was finally completed in the 1920s and those.
Yeah.
So if you look at historically what was going on in the country during that time, you'll see that it reflected really what was going on. The influence of Pasadena at that time was very white oriented, very wealthy, right? It had a lot of connections from the East Coast, and it also then reflected the congregation and the makeup of that church. The Episcopal Church at large also had its own sort of things that it was reckoning it was dealing with, and really, Brian, it wasn't really until the 50s, and 60s that the Episcopal Church opened up to really integrating, an African American community within its own thing, as opposed to a separate,
right.
And that's what it did. It had what they called mission churches. Right. There was a reason they did. Well, anyway, we can get into that also.
Yeah, it's that whole notion of segregation or separate but equal. I think it was demonstrated here in Pasadena as well. There's let's dive into this a little bit more deeply with a project that you're working on. So you have stained glass windows, which some people in the church don't or feel as though they don't uphold the perspective or the values of the church. So what I'd like you to do is, first of all, talk a little bit about how that came about, who recognized that there was kind of not alignment between the church's vision and mission and the stained glass windows, and then what it signifies when we're talking about equity and diversity.
No, look, I need to go back first, though. I need to finish and really from the first question that you asked me about. And I think it's really important because we've had such a reckoning over the last couple of years in terms of racial reckoning, Black Lives Matter, and the way the police respond to our community, that it was really clear within the All Saints community that this needed to be addressed. We have a rector, Mike Kenman, who came in about 5 or 6 years ago. In fact, we joined the church about that time, and he came from Ferguson. Yeah. Right, and he was in Ferguson at the time of where it really exploded.
Right.
But he was also a part of the core ministerial staff that aligned themselves and were allies with the action on the ground. Right, and I think that was really kind of interesting, because when he came here, this was a really big transition from the previous rector, Ed Bacon, and Mike, who was younger and more activist oriented. All Saints Church has always been on the forefront for social justice issues, for inclusion. But what happened in terms of, it was very clear that we needed a process and to say we needed to address this from a congregational, larger, right? And so the Racial Justice Ministry evolved, and our Racial Justice Advisory Board was put together out of that to advise the Vestry on actions that should be taken to make sure that we were moving in the right direction to be inclusive, and that we were addressing issues of bias training and bias and implicit bias, those sort of things, and how to be moving forward. So that was really, that did not exist before, right? And so that was really important. So,
and that's great background. So now, how does that tie into the stained glass windows?
So what happened was, one of the things that we did in terms of, we had a special committee in terms of the vestry where we were trying to do long-term planning. This was prior to the pandemic.
But okay. Long-term as far as the membership or the structure or the physical plan?
The long-term planning is the direction of the church in terms of what was it addressing. We needed to relook at ourselves to see if we were addressing the community at large, where we were.
I see.
It's just like a corporation or whatever, or a company that says, you know what, we need to do some strategic planning. And we have some incredible, talented people that could lead us in that direction. So prior to our vestry conference every year that we have, in 2019, we had a special planning one where we were going to look at long-term issues. This had to do with, one, aging population. This had to do with, high levels of student debt for our younger congregation. This had to do with, just the cost of raising families in this area and how that was going to affect our church. What we didn't know, of course, was the pandemic was right around the corner, and we were right in the middle of the issue with all of the police killings that were going around. And so it became very clear to us that we needed to address and make it a year plan to say, this is going to be our year of dealing with racial reconciliation and white supremacy. And how did that affect our church? And how did that affect the community at large in terms of our relationship to the Pasadena community? So what came out of that were two things.
Yeah, and that's the key point, is what did you all decide? And how are you going to implement it?
Well, there was a bishop that I think at an event in St. Louis that had a sermon, right? And I'm trying to remember her name right now, and I'm sorry, because I will remember. But whenever the point of it was, her sermon was about telling the whole story. Okay, and the point of that sermon about telling the whole story was the fact that she was actually lifting up this church that was consecrating or anointing a new bishop for their thing in St. Louis, right? And what she was basically saying was that in the context of history of this organization, you needed to look at the good and you needed to look at the bad. And that you need to look at it in context of who wrote the history of the organization. And that it was very important to really reset it and allow additional voices and those marginalized voices that never had the voice to have input in terms of what the history was really about, because it would change. And this is one of the things that we came out. So Mike embraced that and said, we need to have our own task of telling our home story. And one of them had to do based off of the stained glass windows in our. Were they inviting? Were they built in a time where they really meant to be inclusive? Do people of color or that are not a part of the majority, are they comfortable in that space with this iconography? And this was really brought to point if you looked at January 6th and you saw the iconography that existed there. It was Christian iconography that was being used as weapons. Right? And
Yeah,
so
for
we had
access
to, yes,
into
we had to look at that. So,
Yeah.
and then the second thing was telling the whole story about the land that the church was on. Who owned it originally? We know that it's the Tongva tribe that really was some of the original inhabitants, indigenous inhabitants here. But how did the church acquire that property? What was the favor? Who had to get displaced for it? And so we want to do that because we found out that when we went into the history that was already written for All Saints Church, it didn't truly reflect. It really was meant to really address the majority at the time and not necessarily really what happened.
Well, and there's one other story that's related to the land, and that's about St. Barnabas Church as well, and its development and the reason why it was created. Has your committee investigated the St. Barnabas Church, and what have you found?
St. Barnabas, yes, absolutely. But I think that, yes, and we have a connection. We're in touch, you know what I mean? There is a community that's there, and that's part of our thing to address. We are really planning a racial reconciliation event, because you have to do that. Once you get through the work, you have to basically say, then what is the process to really do with that? But I think it's really important to understand is that the issue of St. Barnabas is no different than the issue of St. Philip's in Los Angeles. The cathedral in Los Angeles, the main cathedral, St. Philip's is the same relationship as St. Barnabas is to All Saints. And the reason for that is, and I think this is the issue about telling the whole story, is that the Episcopal Church was very reluctant, like a lot of churches were, to anoint and elevate African American pastors and bishops that put them in a position to where they were supervisory and spiritual advisors over white congregations. They did everything they could possibly do to restrict them in terms of their access and limit where they were. So consequently, their solution was not to give them a congregation, but to make it a missionary church. And this was it. St. Barnabas was a missionary church, just like St. Philip's was a missionary church.
There's another layer to that too, and the fact that All Saints parishioners at that time, which is the early 1930s, didn't want people of color in their pews with them.
Well, we're saying the same thing. We're saying the exact same thing. This is no different than the beginning of the African American Episcopal Church, right? Or Absalom Jones, right? They left their congregation specifically for not having access.
Right, because they didn't feel welcome, and that's that whole point you were talking about as far as inclusion. So bringing it to today, the challenge for the church is to help make people of color, African Americans in particular, to feel comfortable in the church, and so that they feel welcome.
Well, that's an interesting how you expressed it, you know what I mean, in terms of, I don't know if it's their duty to do that, you know what I mean, and I don't know, and I'm saying is that I don't know if they recognize that on one level, All Saints is a welcoming church in a lot of different things. It's the awareness of how people feel in certain spaces, right? And I think that's where our advisory board has really brought in, ways for us to really deal with those sort of things. Right now, the All Saints has engaged a third-party diversity organization that's come in and working with the Vestry, and we're on the road to really an 8-month sort of discussion with ourselves. about this, not only just separately in terms of the minorities community among themselves, but also the biases and stuff of the organization at large, and then we'll figure out how to bring that to the congregation at large.
Yeah, and the reason why I bring that up is diversity without inclusion is not productive. So if you diversify, whatever the group is, it could be corporate, it could be a church, it could be a school. If you diversify, but if people still feel as though they're not accepted, they're not treated equally, they're not included, they're not cared for, one, they will begin to show animosity, but two, you may lose them because and workplaces, this happens all the time, where for the diversity side of that equation, you see a range of backgrounds within the context of the employees. But there's high turnover. And there's high turnover because people don't feel included. They don't feel welcome. They don't feel as though it's an equitable place. That's the reason why I bring it up.
Well, spiritual worship, I think, is another discussion that gets really, really complicated, but because people go where they're comfortable. Right, but I just want to bring up a point.
Absolutely.
A point about there's a church in Richmond, Virginia, and it's called St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which was known as the Church of the Confederacy. It was the church of Robert E. Lee, right? And what happened in that particular church, even this is interesting because even as the church changed from the 30s and 40s, because the civil rights movement was changing the demographics in Richmond around that place, and they all of a sudden were getting new members in the 60s and things, but people didn't realize that when they looked around the church, Brian, the stained glass windows were the faces of Confederate generals. They had been purchased by the congregation, and they had embedded themselves not only from an imagery standpoint, but also with an alignment that the lost cause was a Christian event. And that was always going to be something that they were going to be striving for. So it was a wake-up call. Claire and I happened to go to an event called the CEEP Convention, the Commission for Endowed Episcopal Parishes, in 2017, and we saw a presentation from St. Paul's Church of what happened, and this happened after the what was it, that right to whatever, the right wing event that happened, and they had the big riot in Richmond, in Virginia, during that time,
right.
And that was the wake up call for them.
Well, there was
right?
Charlottesville.
That's right. It was the wake up call, and then the congregation all of a sudden
it was a white torch rally.
It was the tiki. That's right. It was the tiki torches and stuff that watched. But what happened was, believe it or not, people weren't really aware of how much the racism and the Confederate ideology was embedded in their physical place.
Well, and that goes back to your point earlier of telling the whole story, or telling I would say, the accurate story, or the comprehensive story. And as a storyteller in your other work, this seems to resonate really with you as far as your efforts on the racial justice ministry and also your professional work. I mean, why is storytelling so important, and how does it shape society, or how does it change society?
Well, we're in a huge battle right now, which is just getting started with, quote, this thing called critical race theory. Mm-hmm. And I think this is, it's going to be a struggle for a long time. Hannah Nicole Jones, who is the reporter for the New York Times that did the 1619 Project, lit the match on this whole thing. And I think she's taking a tremendous amount of attack on it, but has withstood it very importantly, because the question was, those who had been charged with telling the history weren't asked permission to tell this story. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we need to have more of our voices that have not been included in the table. And I have to commend, the Los Angeles Times has an incredible project, which is called the Civic Memory Project.
You mentioned that to me before.
And it's called the Past Due project. And if anybody goes to the Los Angeles Times website and looks for civic memory past due, they will see this. Mayor Garcetti has assembled an incredible team, and they've spent a lot of work, and they have this website that has brought in all these other voices to really tell the true story about Los Angeles and who contributed to it, who was suffered as a result of decisions that were made in it, about locations and about communities and those sort of things. It's really quite extensive, and there's very few communities around the country that have really committed this to it. We had the members of that committee at All Saints at one of our forums, and I think it's amazing. And we're kind of patterning what we're doing after that, which is basically saying, okay, on the local level, we're going to look at what people haven't seen before, right? And I think what happened one time, Brian, was you did an event in online because you're a historian yourself and have really assembled a lot of information about the history of Pasadena and its effect on the African American community here. And one of the things that came out of the post discussion on that was a gentleman that had been a member of Caltech and had been raised in Pasadena since the early 60s. And he said at the end of the discussion, and I kid you not, I've lived in this city for over 45 years and I know nothing about this history. And this history was what? This history had to do with the elimination of the community from when the freeway was built.
Right.
The plunge pool.
Yeah,
right?
redlining, the Brookside Plunge.
Right. Was it not Vernon, but what's the street off of Fair Oaks?
Yeah, Vernon
Yeah,
Avenue.
That's right, Vernon Avenue, and then south of Colorado Boulevard, which was a thriving African American community, which nobody knows now because there's only one church left there, Friendship Baptist Church.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's so important to me, and I'm glad you mentioned that at the outset, that people learn their history. And as a documentarian and a person who's in film and video, I'm really curious as to your take about, for example, you have done documentaries like the Defiant Ones that was about Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine. What is your hope with those? How do you hope to inform or educate the public about these types of stories? It feels like until we learn about our history, it's not that we repeat the mistakes, which of course is true, but it just feels like we have blinders. It's kind of like I think it was Chip who said that, is that we move through the world without really the best and highest information to make decisions, and then when we do make decisions, it's to the detriment of certain parts of our community. Yes.
Well, this whole conversation is going to be a challenge going forward, because what has morphed from not the first time. I mean, I'm talking about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s was one thing, right? And it was that uprising that really brought attention to it, but it wasn't until the media got involved, right? And they saw actually what was going on. What is happening today is a little bit different because of the leadership is different, but it's still one of those things where you had Black Lives Matter be this movement that coalesced the discussion and brought in a lot of younger people, and also it brought in a more coalition, sort of a rainbow kind of coalition of people that were really on it. The problem that comes in, or not the problem, the challenge is the discussion is uncomfortable. The discussion is not an easy discussion, because those decisions that you're talking about, there are those that would rather not deal with the past and say that it informs our future.
Well, that's the whole critical race theory dialogue right now, or it's not even actually a dialogue, it's more of a polemic. I mean, it's that there are certain school districts around the country that are actually prohibiting the naming of critical race theory as a potential curricular activity.
Yes.
So you're absolutely right that it's a painful conversation, and it's one that a lot of people want to avoid. So maybe what are your thoughts about how do we encourage them, or encourage that, sometimes I call them the racism skeptics, that this is valuable not only information, but time well spent to dive into what critical race theory is about.
Well, I haven't really embraced that was my job, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the issues in where the fatigue and trauma comes from it, because what ends up happening, those people that have experienced the trauma also are being charged with, right, correcting and whatever.
So,
but let me just say
Yeah.
this. Let me just say that the fact of the matter is that people need to see the connections of not just the critical race theory discussion, but also the fact that we have 400 bills across this country that are in state legislators to restrict access to voting in African American communities.
Yeah.
They are the same. They are the same. So you can't separate these things. But so I think the task is, how do we tell stories that draws a thread through these things and saying, hey, look it, these aren't siloed events. These are things that, I'm sorry, I have to use the word systematic. They are systematic. And what do we do to overcome that? How do we come together to recognize that? And then what do we do to change it? That's the battleground.
And my question was around the racial justice ministry, and not Stephen personally. I don't want to saddle you with this responsibility, but I was just wondering if the ministry had had conversations about how do we broaden the discussion? How do we engage more people? How do we combat the racism skeptics? How do we build momentum?
Well, I think All Saints, the Racial Justice Ministry, yes, is involved in that, but I think All Saints at large has always been an open discussion place. They've had the forum. They've always brought in thinkers. We just recently had before the summer, we had a woman, I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, but she wrote a book about the rise of Christian nationalism in this country. There's not many churches that are bringing in those kind of discussions, right? And that was really important because that was tied to January 6th. That is tied to the current discussion in terms of the support for Trump and the redefining of what this country is all about. As we know, one of the largest Bible publishers in the country, Zondervan, is publishing books that tie the Bible to the Constitution, as if they're one and the same, right? And it's completely trying to redo history from a certain advantage. And I think we really need to lean into that. All Saints has been really good. In fact, that was the thing that drew my wife and I to All Saints, was that fact that there's places where Mike and has shared the pulpit and brought in thinkers from other parts of the country. Kelly Brown Douglas, who's over at Union Theological Seminary, Stephanie Sellers. There's, really great people that we've really had. Tim Wise, we've had some really great people.
It's a fantastic platform, and I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Oh, sorry, it went so fast.
And I wish we could talk longer because we've just touched the surface.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that the audience will conduct more research, find out more about what All Saints is doing, but also the LA Times Project, which I think is fantastic.
Absolutely it is.
So thank you so much for being with us today. I really
enjoyed
appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.